One year turned out to be hard. Yeah, it's good. I mean, difficult times otherwise, you know. But yeah,
Sure. Give us 2 minutes. No. It is like welcome, welcome. If am I hope the sound is on. All right. I'm going to do a very brief opening here. My name is John Tutino, and it's been my great privilege and honor to oversee the Georgetown Americas. Used to be Initiative, it's now the Forum, for more than 20 years. And it's a great pleasure to introduce today's event. I want to quickly do a couple of acknowledgments. One to Rachel Singer. It was all her idea to begin with. And it kind of got out of hand, but I hope she's okay with how it expanded on us. I want to thank the folks from the Georgetown's Americas Institute who do tech and bring us by tech to a world in ways we couldn't possibly do. Denise Yanovich, who is, we'll get to Denise Yanovich, who's the associate director, and Kate Blanchett, who does the hands-on hard work for us so often. And I want to thank Rebecca Stowe, who does so much of the forum assistance work preparation for all of this. Beyond that, I just want to say we have 2 very different books by 2 kind of different authors on ecology, power, and culture in Brazil. One looking at energy and power, but with environmental and cultural impacts, and one looking at a beverage, but in a larger perspective. And we hope we bring it together. And I simply want to say, I never imagined in the past that we would recruit into the same program, but we couldn't get them in the same room because poor Barbara Weinstein's stuck in Venice. And I did ask if she'd be willing to bring us all to Venice to do the program, but that didn't work out for us. But we have, as commentators, 2 of the most distinguished historians, Barbara Weinstein, historian of environment, women and gender and war in Brazil, John McNeil, a global environmentalist historian, and amazingly, each commentator has been a president of the American Historical Association. Doesn't happen very often at an event like this. So I just want to introduce the whole program in general, say how happy I am it all came together so nicely. And I am going to hand things off to my colleague, Brian McCann, professor of Brazilian history, hanging out as a dean in the college these days and doing good things for the larger university, but happy to join us for a program on Brazil. So I'm going to pass session oversight to Brian. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, John. And indeed, I am very happy to be here today. It is a genuine pleasure to introduce Matt Johnson, our presenter today, to be here for this panel on Brazilian history, to take a step away from administrative work for the moment. And thanks so much to John Tutino for setting this all up, and to Georgetown Americas Institute, Denise Yanovich, and to the Environmental History Workshop as well, and to all of you. It's a great pleasure to welcome Matt, our former doctoral student and now at the High Meadows Environmental Institute at Princeton University. And as John said, we have these very distinguished commentators, Barbara Weinstein and John McNeil. Barbara Weinstein, the Silver Professor of History. It is my obligation to say that we could not get the Gold Professor of History. If Barbara were visible now, she'd be rolling her eyes. She gets that joke all the time, but you may not have heard it. So, yes. Yeah. And John McNeil as well. So this will be a fantastic, generally wears the tinfoil hat. Yeah. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Matt for a brief presentation of the highlights of his important and profound and extremely well researched book, and then over to our distinguished commentators.
Those ones. Oh, getting ahead of myself. Wow. Well, thank you all so much for having me. It genuinely is a huge honor to be here. Thank you to everyone that's in attendance, to the organizers. To repeat John's remarks, right? Everyone that he acknowledged. I just want to give a heartfelt thank you for inviting me here to come back and talk about a book that began here, that began at Georgetown as a dissertation in the history department here. And that had grown into a project that I recently published last June with Cambridge University Press. My plan for these remarks are to talk to you for about 25 to 30 minutes, divided into two parts. The first being how I came to this topic and why it's important. And the second about the contents, arguments, and contribution. I'm going to intentionally prioritize the first part and take my time with it. So I'll go through part two in as much detail as I'm able to, with allowing more time for discussion on those substantive parts in discussion and then in Q&A with you all. So this is a book about electricity, and so I always like to start these book talks with the electricity in this room. So I'm curious, does anyone have a good sense of what's powering these lights here? Coal? Okay, we got coal. Anyone else? Any ideas? Or does anyone know? Okay, we got charisma. Yeah, some organic energy floating around here. Anyone else? All right. So the lights in this room, I did. This is pulled from Pepco's website. The one on the left is from when I taught global energy history here back in 2021, and then the one on the right is the most recent one I could find on short notice on the internet. But most of the power in this room comes from the grid from Pepco that Georgetown sources from. And that's, as you can see here, about a mix of natural gas, coal, and nuclear. So heavy fossil fuel and the nuclear mix as well in this room. However, since Georgetown's in the middle of a big sustainability initiative, on paper, the electricity comes from here, these solar plants. So basically, they have bought credits for these solar power plants. So although the energy itself materially comes from the grid, it is sort of offset and with these solar plants. So ostensibly, all of solar, although practically from the grid I just showed. And one of the points I really want to sort of hit on with this introduction is that this is just pulled from Georgetown's website, right? Georgetown, like almost every university that I've given this talk at, and most cities and places in the world right now, is in the middle of a big energy transition, right? To respond to the climate crisis, the world right now is undergoing a big decarbonization push. And for this audience, I don't need to go into how bad the climate crisis is and how important low carbon energy is. So for historians, though, the question that I came to this PhD program with was, what experiences do we have with past examples of low carbon energy and their trade-offs. What can we learn from history to help inform this transition? And I also want to highlight that the stakes are pretty high for this question, right? Because um, there have been surfaced recently a bunch of cases where there's been pushback against low carbon energy projects, right? So when I was before this fellowship at Princeton, I was in Massachusetts, and I attended a couple events there where there was pushback against solar power for deforesting land, right, to plant solar farms. Another tagline here, right, is New England forests are raised, experts urge smarter siting, say this sort of misses the plot on the climate crisis. Even closer to home, right, back in 2019 when I was here, there was a controversy over Georgetown's own solar panel siting, right? Tagline here, environmentalists are in a position they never imagined, fighting a solar project, right? So the stakes are pretty high in this moment where we urgently need decarbonization, but yet have to wrestle with trade-offs in an energy system. And so again, the question is, what are the past examples of low carbon energy to inform a just transition? And looking backwards, it's not solar and wind, although that's currently growing as the precedents for this transition, but sources that have a longer history at scale, like nuclear and hydropower. Indeed, hydropower is the oldest and biggest source of low carbon energy to date. It has cumulatively spared the Earth's atmosphere more carbon emissions than any other source of low carbon energy, although hopefully that will change in the near future as solar, wind, and other projects rise. And there is, of course, a deep literature on hydropower dams. But none of it focuses explicitly on greenhouse gas emissions or climate change, and most focus on individual dams or river basins. So this is just a very small sampling of a very big literature, but to give you an idea that a lot of the literature is about single dams, which is I've separated on the right here, taking individual case studies from high-profile dams. Scholars also tend to write about dams as part of a larger river system, such as the ones here in the middle, the Columbia, Colorado, and the Yellow River here. Or sometimes they write about entire regions, like the arid west, or in an agency, like the Bureau of Reclamation, and it's the book on the farthest right, and its efforts to plan dams abroad. So these are great literature, but none of it really is calibrated to the framing, right, of the energy transition and this question of trade-offs with the climate crisis. So what is a good case study then to weigh those trade-offs? So to me, the first thing I thought of, well, the best case study would be a country that gets a high percentage of its electricity from hydropower, right? Are there any countries in the world that have succeeded in building a grid that is primarily hydropower or low carbon based? And it turns out there are. So this is just a short overview from what I compiled from the World Bank. You could see just some countries that have more than 60% of their electricity from hydropower. One thing you might notice from it is that Latin America stands out. And indeed, Latin America is sort of one of the key regions in the world for hydropower, gets a much higher percentage of its electricity from hydropower than do many other parts of the world. So that seems sort of a good criteria at first. The second question we might ask is about scale, right? Because while any of these countries can teach us really valuable lessons about low carbon energy and hydropower, the question with the energy transition is really a question of scalability, right? There are individual projects that we've seen, solar panels, on rooftops, small dams for individual places, but the question to try to decarbonize an entire grid is really a question of scale. And so for me, the ideal case study is one that also has a merit of scale on that respect. And so using both population and economic growth and output as proxies for electricity consumption, we can see that these are some of the countries in the world that have the biggest population, right? And then here are some countries that have the biggest economies, and there's 11 listed here. I went for the top 10, but Italy and Brazil tied for 10th in the data set I was looking at, so they're both up there. So you have, here are some of the biggest economies, right? And hopefully what stands out of you as I've gone through these is that only one dot stays the same in all those photos, right? And that is Brazil. And so my argument is that Brazil is really the ideal case study for understanding our history with low carbon energy and hydropower specifically, because it has such a high proportion of its electricity from hydropower, and because it is one of the world's biggest countries in terms of population and economies, and thus in terms of energy consumption and output as well. Indeed, in terms of gross output, Brazil is second only to China in terms of hydropower output. Now you'll notice that this is out of date. If you see the top up there, this is my favorite graphic in terms of displayed, and it's sourced from BP. But rest assured, the proportions are the same. The numbers have changed, but at least for the top three, for China, Brazil, and Canada, they remain the top three in that order in terms of gross output. China produces a lot, but it is such a big country that hydropower only makes up about 20% of its grid. Most of the electricity is coming from coal, I believe some from natural gas. And then you have Brazil and Canada as sort of the two countries after that that both produce a lot, and it ends up meeting a high percentage of their grid. Lastly, we might also want a case study that has a deep history, right? Not a country that hasn't just, has a recent experience with hydropower, but that has had a long time to wrestle with this technology. Brazil also fits that criteria as well. In the early years, when electrification from about the 1880s to the 1920s, when it was more, networks were more diffuse, there was coal-fired power plants, there were wood-fired power plants, there was a more diverse assortment of energy. But since the country built big grids starting in the 10s and 20s, Brazil has never gotten less than 80%, less than 60%, often more than 80, 90% of its electricity from hydropower. So for all those reasons, I was really drawn to Brazil as an ideal case study for exploring these trade-offs from a historical lens. The book that I wrote focuses on this period here. As you can see, uptick in hydropower growth. And what this graphic shows is just the percentage of electricity. But what I want to highlight is that underneath that rise, highlighted by the innermost concentric circle, is also a big boom, a big demographic boom, a big economic boom, and of course a big dam building boom, right? This was a time from the 60s to the 80s where Brazil underwent a period of tremendous economic growth. This was a time, as I'll talk about shortly, when Brazil was under a right-wing military dictatorship that floored the pedal on industrial growth and built a lot of dams. Now, the inner concentric circle is the main focus of the book, this period of dams that were built between the 60s and the 80s. And the outer concentric circle is about as far back as the book goes and as far forward, right? It explores a little bit of the prehistory before the dictatorship took over and built dams. And then it also takes some of the impacts up to the present as well. So I hope I have, let me see. Yeah. I hope I have convinced you of why Brazil is an important case study in global environmental energy history with tremendous contemporary relevance. Now, why this book and not another book on Brazilian hydropower dams? So turning over to the historiography on and the literature on Brazilian dams in particular, there is, of course, a lot written about Brazilian dams. And I also want to make a plug, especially a lot written in Brazil in Portuguese. Of course, that is where most of the literature that has existed on Brazilian dams resides. And I want to make 2 points about this literature. One is that comparatively little of it is by historians, right? A lot of the scholars that have been working on Brazilian dams have been writing about them in a contemporary sense. Some of the dams that I study even in this book, there's great scholarship from the 80s and 90s, and then also going forward on more recent dams that were built. But there is to date few historians that have looked backwards at this dam building boom in recent history. The second is that all of it is fragmented. Paralleling the slide I showed earlier, most of the scholarship tends to focus on just one case study. And especially the Itaipu Binational Dam, which I'll talk about in Paraguay, is often gets a lot of attention. These are 2 wonderful books that I highly recommend by scholars on Itaipu Dam. And the point here is simply that their scale is one of doing a deep dive on not just the one dam, but in some cases, often on just one impact of those dams. For example, Jacob Blanc's great book offers a lot of depth on the movement of displaced farmers to fight for just indemnity before Itaipu was built. So again, a great literature to build on, but still not one perfectly calibrated to this question of greenhouse gas emissions and the trade-off with low carbon energy. So the book I wrote builds on this literature to try to tell the story at a national scale without sacrificing too much depth. And to do that, I chose 5 case studies. This is an abridged map from the one it's in the book that Jeffrey Wallace produced. All the black dots are showing the cohort of about 25 dams. The dictatorship built more than 25 dams, but these 25 were the ones responsible for most of the power. And I chose 5 of those that were the biggest and had the biggest environmental impacts. They were the iconic showpiece projects of the regime. And I also chose case studies that had a geographic distribution. So Itaipu, the first case study in the southwest, was a binational dam built with Paraguay. Sobradinho and Itaparica, 2 dams on the Rio San Francisco and the semi-arid northeast, and then 2 dams in Amazonia, Tucuruí and Balbina. So all of these dams were built by the state government, by companies, by state companies, and they were built largely to power cities in the southeast. But yet they expanded outward, right? This was a moment of geographic expansion for the Brazilian state, a period of national integration, and they integrated sort of far-flung hinterlands, so to speak, like the rural northeast and Amazonia, in part using these big dam projects. So in short, my book is to date the only English language environmental history of Brazilian hydropower, and it does it at a national scale with global framing and with deep research. All right. Now, for the second part of this talk, I'd like to go into some of the content of the book itself. I organized the book chronologically and more importantly, sequentially. And what I mean by that is that it sets the scene, then it goes into the planning and building of the dams, what the government did or did not do to mitigate impacts as during the planning stage and as the reservoir filled, and then it turns to the impacts themselves and what their consequences were. Again, this is just an abridged table of contents. This is not, in my effort to make the slides more digestible, I've sort of altered the actual title, so you'll see the full title in the book. But hopefully this gives you a broad idea of how it's structured. And it's structured around 3 arguments that come in each of the chapters. The first couple chapters, setting the scene, and then the one about planning and building, introduce the main protagonists for the dam building boom. Again, these were state companies that built the dams, and under military rule, the impetus behind the dams consisted of a small cohort of military officials and planners, economic and engineering planners, a small clique of individuals that work closely together to promote and build big dams. And in the book, I call this group modern pharaohs. And in fact, the temple of my dissertation here was temples of modern pharaohs. And you may find it a curious reference about how the Egyptian pharaohs showed up in a book about Brazilian dams. I've actually got text about this from friends confused that apparently librarians were confused when they asked about a dissertation about Brazilian dams with pharaohs in it. In any case, during the 1960s and 70s, the term pharaonic projects circulated widely throughout Brazil. And it's somewhat controversial in that it is mostly has a negative connotation, but importantly for me at least, not completely. I have found references where this was used in a positive connotation. And so the common denominator, the lowest common denominator in this, is basically to make a connection with the big pyramids in Egypt, right? These big, grandiose showcase engineering projects. So that was kind of the common denominator. The next layer, though, is that and I actually interviewed one of the head engineers for a dam, and on the page that I gave him about my project, the title was on there, and he took offense to it and said, "Well, I don't agree with this title. I suggest you change it because these are not pharaonic projects." And his argument was that the temples in Egypt didn't do anything, right? They were useless. They were just showpiece projects, and the dams did, right? These were useful. They brought electricity and all that. Of course, when I told this to John McNeil, he said that in fact the ancient Egyptian pyramids were useful for people that believed in ancient Egyptian religion. So of course there was some use there. In any case, though, there is this tension with this term that gets used often negatively. In any case, it was everywhere in the sources that I found. In the opening for the chapter 6 on the Balbina Dam, even a group of Brazilian engineers charged with building that dam criticized the project and called it a pharaonic project. So these are pharaonic projects, and their builders, we might call them pharaohs. And so I've used that term that I thought captured really sort of the spirit of the authoritarian nature, the sort of tight network of these officials building the dams, and their their energy in promoting big showpiece projects like this. The first argument of the book is that this group committed to building big dams quickly and with little attention to social and environmental impacts. They did this in part because both economic growth and national integration were seen as a source of political legitimacy for the dictatorship. This was a group of officials, military officials, that took over in a coup, and that sort of marketed that takeover as necessary to sort of put Brazil back on the track of economic growth. And so to build big dams that could produce electricity and generate revenue in the short term, that they use that essentially as a source of legitimacy, as well as integrating areas of the country in the context of the Cold War and worries about both geopolitical turmoil and also internal revolt. This was a goal in which they hope to sort of grow the pie rather than redistribute resources, right? Just generate dovetailing with sort of classic Cold War right-wing ideology. The idea was to grow the pie and generate more revenue for everyone without having to redistribute anything. So again, committed to building big dams quickly, little attention to social and environmental impacts. But this cohort couldn't completely ignore environment altogether. As I talk about in the first chapters, the 1960s and 70s were also a period of rising attention to social and environmental justice around the world, especially the rise of environmentalism. And this was a worldwide phenomenon. It happened domestically within Brazil. It also was happening among the lending agencies, such as the World Bank, which were giving a lot of money to the government to build big projects like dams. So they couldn't ignore this tide completely. The second argument of the book is that to address the rising tide of social and environmental justice movements, the Brazilian government prioritized what I've called pharaonic environmentalism. Basically, showcase projects that would boost the environmental credentials as much as possible without having to modify dam designs or slow down timelines. And that's significant because often building the dams at a slower pace, in which there was more time to inform and compensate people that were displaced, or modifying their designs so that they had less of an impact, were often the most substantive mitigation measures that they could have made. And my argument here is that they remain committed to building the dams as they were originally designed with high impacts, and that their environmentalism amounted to, again, this sort of these showpiece projects, right? Sort of greenwashing with the flair, if you will. And the pinnacle of this was animal rescue missions. And so I don't have time to get into the details and shortcomings in depth, but essentially the government sent teams of rescuers to pick up animals off treetops. And not only were there problems, was it of sort of dubious efficacy in terms of the animals themselves, it also came with a huge opportunity cost, as the image on the right highlights. This is from a indigenous advocate who wrote an article criticizing these programs and the relative costs between the rescue missions and the compensation for the Ava Guarani that Itaipu displaced. And the text on the right, Arquiji Itaipu, Indio no entra, is in English, Itaipu's Ark, indigenous people not welcome. And so the idea here being, right, that there was environmental racism associated with prioritizing saving animals over justly compensating indigenous people as well. Now, the second part of the book, again, goes into the impacts about what actually happened. And the argument that undergirds these final chapters is that the unmitigated impacts were very damaging and inspired a backlash against hydropower. Chapter 4 talks about the social impacts and the displacement, which often happened with very delayed and comparatively poor compensation. This is the Itaparica Dam in the northeast on the Rio San Francisco. Two groups that were displaced. On the left, a group of rural workers. On the right, the Tuxa, an indigenous group whose homeland was flooded by the dams. And the Tuxa, to this day, still don't have land. They were promised land in the late 80s in compensation for this dam. Very tragically, the members of the Tuxa that are my age call themselves the generation without land because they were born at a time when the group was still fighting to get compensated for the dam, and they still don't have land. I did actually, when I gave a talk yesterday, and someone in the audience informed me that the Ava Guarani, the community I just talked about before, has gotten land within the last couple weeks even. So there's some good news on that front that I need to look at. This is 24 hours ago I received this news, so but I'm excited to look into that and see what came of that, because that would be a huge win. But from everyone I've talked to, the Tusha remain without land, and they can continue to fight. So those were some of the social impacts. The dams also came with big environmental impacts, most famously the flooding of Sechiquedas, which was the biggest waterfall in the world by volume. For anyone that's been to the Iguazu Falls on the Brazil-Argentina border, this was about 20 times that in terms of volume of water. Just upstream on the Rio Paraná, it now is underwater. It was a national park at the time. It was flooded. It was abolished as a national park and flooded by the Itaipu Dam. So these dams came with these big costs. I talk about in the book also fishing, what these dams did for the fisheries, which were not universally bad, but had detrimental impacts on the people fishing there. I also talk about the impacts for malaria and for mosquito swarms as well. So in essence, they created a huge impact. And the last couple chapters of the book really explore the reaction to those impacts. And I used the Balbina Dam as a watershed moment. It's the only dam of the 5 case studies that gets its own chapter. That's because it was built chronologically later. It was the last most infamous of the dictatorship's dam. It was built later, and it also came under the most scrutiny. As I mentioned earlier, even the engineers turned on Balbina. It also happened at a moment when Brazil returned to democracy. So not only had Brazil experienced these catastrophes at the other dams in the preceding years, but after 1985, when the military government turned over to civilian rule, there was more freedom of press and more means to publicize and denounce these impacts. So all of that accumulated in Balbina, and it really became the poster child for sort of how not to build a dam, if you will. And thereafter, there was a big anti-dam movement that coalesced, and as I talk about in the book, had really important impacts, unequally divided across Brazil. The biggest impacts in installing dams has been in the Amazon. As you might infer from my comments a few minutes ago, the anti-dam movement was less successful in getting compensation for communities already displaced, like the Tuxa and Guarani, but nevertheless, a really powerful movement that emerged in Brazil. These top 2 photos are from the Balbina Dam, from some of the protest literature that was published in the late 80s. The bottom one is an iconic photo of the a Caiapau leader confronting an Eletronorte, this state company, that in a meeting about what is now the Belo Monte Dam in the Amazon, which was built much later by Brazil's democratic government. So the book really concludes with these stories of protests and backlash. Now, see how I'm doing on time. Okay, I'll go very, very quickly through some contributions here. I hope this book, sits in the middle of a Venn diagram, so to speak, right, where it can contribute to various different buckets of very different, whether it's environmental history, Brazilian history, Latin American history, et cetera. First and foremost, I hope to bring environmental history and the story of Brazilian dams to a wide audience, to sort of, integrate this story and into the literature and disseminate it as widely as possible. For those with more familiarity to the field, for dams, social and environmental justice, maybe even some of these dams that I've been talking about, that sort of have a general idea of the narrative arc and the contour, I want to offer a couple concluding points and contributions. The first one is actually the one that I'm most proud of, and that is new evidence. So through both persistence and also luck, I was able to dig up a lot of sources, most of them that were either underutilized or unutilized, especially in the Anglophone literature. So I was able to get into a lot of archives, get into the companies and the personal papers of engineers and politicians themselves. I was granted access to some of the state archives in that respect. I also was able to get into archives of NGOs and the personal papers of advocates and some of the scientists that protested some of these dams. So I hope as sort of the first tier, right, that this book offers at least a lot of new evidence to a story that maybe the general contours of have been sort of floating around and out there for a little while. And I think that new evidence really brings, it's not just quantitative, but also qualitative. It brings depth to narrative and arguments. Documents like this one that were written by the Aba Guarani, this is that group displaced by Itaipu, wrote to the World Bank, who didn't actually fund Itaipu Dam, but was funding the entire power sector, and they knew this, and they knew that in 1986 there was a loan, the second part of the loan was due, and they knew that the World Bank cared about its environmental image, and they wrote it to protest their situation. So the book is full of documents like this that really give a lot of texture to the story. Now, as far as the more substantive contributions, again, I hope they're multiple, and we can talk about some of these in discussion and in Q&A. It certainly has arguments that pertain to the controversial legacy of Brazil's military dictatorship, not just authoritarianism in Brazil, but there's also been a debate recently about authoritarian environmentalism in general. A group of scholars in the last 10 or 20 years have argued that because democracies have sort of dropped the ball on climate change, maybe what we need is sort of strong-armed environmental government. And so the book obviously can speak to sort of not just the fallacy of that, but again, adding more depth about the relationship between authoritarianism and environmentalism in the past. It has a lot to say about dams as political objects. Dams not just as sort of the technical products of engineers, but also the way that politics and geopolitics intrude in siting and planning. And it also can add to discussions about the Anthropocene, right? A new era in which humans have emerged as a geologic force in Earth's history, of which dams were a big part of that. The one that I want to hit on for you all here is to bring us back right where I started, and this question of the climate crisis and the energy transition. And I want to sort of end with 2 points for why studying history and why studying deep context of these projects is really important for informing that. And this map of Amazonia really is important for both. The first one is that I've been talking through this whole presentation about dams as a source of low carbon energy. And that's true, generally speaking. They are. Compared to natural gas, coal, oil, right? The dams emit much less greenhouse gases than do those sources. But not all dams can be considered low carbon energy. Dams in the Amazon, it turns out, actually emit about as much greenhouse gas emissions as coal-fired power plants. And so the reason they do this is because the Amazon forest is incredibly dense and full of vegetation. And when you flood a giant forest full of that dense vegetation, it dies and decomposes. Some of the carbon is released in the form of carbon dioxide from the trees, but more importantly, all that vegetation that is deep enough to be in the anoxic bottom layer of the reservoir, anoxic meaning no oxygen, it turns into methane. And methane is a really potent greenhouse gas. And so when that methane-laced water then gets funneled out and dropped through the turbine, through the spillways, it releases like a soda cap, like a soda bottle cap if you take it off, and shoots up like methane. And so in the 90s, some researchers looked into this and calculated it for Tucuruí and Balbina. The rate was about on par with coal-fired power plants. So it's really important, again, to understand sort of some place-based context for this. But more generally, I think this map of Amazonia highlights sort of a bigger and more general point that's applicable beyond Amazonia and beyond hydropower dams being with. And that is that we might expect a backlash for poorly planned low-carbon energy projects with high impact. You'll see here in this map a bunch of black dots. Now, all the black dots are the dams that were not built. Those were the dams that were planned but never built, that the dictatorship hoped that civilian government would carry out, but never did. And economics explains part of this. I've talked to engineers who have said, yes, in the 80s, there was economic crisis and we had to slow down, but the money returned, and it has really been the backlash from indigenous people and from environmentalists that have stalled this push. And some of the dams that were built, as I talk about in the book, were built in a much modified, scaled-down design. Even Belo-Monte, for all its controversies, was a much reduced low-impact dam compared to its original design, which was 2 big reservoirs. So again, I think that the sort of takeaway from that story is that carrying out big low-carbon energy projects without investing in proper social and environmental safeguards will likely create a political backlash against all of those projects, and that therefore investing in social and environmental justice is important not just for its own sake, but also in maintaining the political momentum for decarbonization, which we urgently need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt, for that excellent overview of the book and its context. Much appreciated and very illuminating. And now we will turn it over to Barbara Weinstein.
Okay, well, I seem to be on 2 screens. I'm seeing 2 screens, but are you seeing me just on 1 screen?
We see you on 1 screen, just perfectly.
That's great. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you to all of you for allowing me to participate from a long distance. And I'm really, I can't say I'm sorry I'm in Venice, but I can say that I'm sorry I'm not there with you to spend the evening in person. And if we could magically transport ourselves to another continent, I would be there. So I want to start first. Let me bring up my notes so I know what I'm going to say. Excuse me a second. Okay, so I want to start by saying how much I enjoyed reading Matthew Johnson's book, Hydropower in Authoritarian Brazil. I read it um, after I got the invitation to participate. And I'm very glad that, these days so many books are being published, and there are so many things that we have to read, published and unpublished, that it's difficult to find time for things that you should read. And so I sometimes welcome somebody saying, well, you have to read this. And I'm really glad because I really did have to read this. This is a book that's extraordinarily important for anybody interested in the recent history of Brazil. That is Brazil since the mid 20th century. So let me start by saying I was living in Brazil, Sao Paulo to be exact, in October 1982, and remember very vividly the headlines in all the local papers announcing that the Sete Quedas, or as is termed in the book, Guaíra Falls, were no more. There was at the time only an embryonic environmental protection movement in Brazil. So while there were expressions of sadness, of loss, there was no organized outrage. And I want to just say as an aside that as some of you know, my first book was on the Amazon during the rubber boom, and I encountered a certain resistance to the idea that a historian should make their first book a book about Amazonian history, because at that point in time, while it was assumed that soil scientists and anthropologists and maybe even ethnohistorians would work on the Amazon, there was relatively little interest in the history of the Amazon and the history of indigenous people in the Amazon. So there wasn't just not much of an environmental movement, but just general disinterest in the region. Um, so, but going back to the Sete Quedas, with this memory in mind, I was intrigued to read a book that focused on the building of dams during the military dictatorship. I learned a great deal from the book, though I do wonder whether a jazzier title might attract more readers. I understand that historians want to make sure that their books, especially their first books, have serious titles. My first book, after all, was just The Amazon Rubber Boom, though my mother jazzed it up by routinely referring to it as The Amazing Rubber Boom. Definitely a title that it would have sold more copies, right? But I think a little more something a little more lyrical would draw in more readers. And this book deserves a wide readership, given the incredible research and the many sobering history lessons Matthew Johnson has packed into its pages. Johnson's overall argument at first glance seems pretty straightforward and definitely not counterintuitive. The military dictatorship that ruled Brazil from 64 to 85 was eager to advance industrialization and economic development at breakneck speed, and saw energy supply as a potential bottleneck, and with the price of petroleum rising, sunk significant resources and efforts into pharaonic projects. A phrase, let me say, that whenever I heard it used, was used negatively. It was never used admiringly. Because it came into popular use, at least, once it was clear that how many of these projects were not working out the way they were supposed to. My particular favorite being the Rodovia dos Imigrantes in São Paulo, from the capital down to the coast, which remained unfinished for about 20 years because they only ran out of money after they had finished just one side of the highway. So basically, this is a story that's, starting with Timothy Mitchell's book, The Rule of Experts, is well known about sort of high modernism and the deployment of huge hydroelectric dams, both to demonstrate a growing modernity, in Brazil's case, a growing modernity and potencia power, and to provide the energy needed by rapidly growing urban centers. The frantic push to modernize and develop in an authoritarian context of censorship and repression meant that the government devoted little effort to working out the drawbacks of massive dam building, especially in the Amazon, to providing resources to those most severely impacted, and to considering the long-term human and environmental implications. As should be obvious, Matthew Johnson is critical, at times severely critical, of the pharaonic works of the dictatorship, and provides ample detail of insensitivity, indifference, and I want to emphasize in corruption, because a lot of people refer to the corruption under the military regime, but not a lot of people have done the kind of research that allows them to talk with more specificity about corruption during that regime. But at the same time, I was impressed by his concern to discuss potentially positive aspects of these projects. For example, the savings in terms of greenhouse gas emissions of the non-Amazon hydroelectric dams, or his acknowledgement, even as he is elegantly and rightly excoriating, oh my goodness, my machine is saying my internet connection is unstable, but hopefully it'll hold out. And he is elegantly excoriating those involved in the building of the disastrous Balbina Dam in the Amazon, that the decision to build it has to be considered in light of the desperate immediate need for electrical power in the rapidly growing city of Manaus. And I want to emphasize here that no matter what environmentalists might think about the Amazon or groups that are supporting indigenous rights, it is notable that around 80% of the Amazon's population lives in cities. Whatever people imagine the Amazon to be, it is primarily an urban society, pretty much like the rest of Brazil. In other words, without wasting time trying to seem balanced, quote unquote, Johnson nonetheless makes it clear that these were complicated decisions that often produced unforeseen consequences that were unlikely to be predicted even by the most detailed environmental impact study. At the same time, he also makes it clear that certain impacts on human beings, such as the flooding of lands inhabited by thousands of people, indigenous and non-indigenous, were entirely predictable, and yet the government did little to prepare those populations or compensate them appropriately for their losses. Whether due to racism and class prejudice or simple greed, many of the politicians and engineers involved in these projects turned a deaf ear to the complaints of their victims, and the absence of a significant environmentalist movement or a meaningful public sphere meant that victims had little means to drum up support until the 1980s. There are many aspects of this book that I would be happy to discuss at greater length, but I probably don't have the time. But I want to mention just a couple that I found particularly engaging. One theme that Johnson uses to excellent effect is the way in which the military performed environmental concern, for example, for entities like the World Bank, especially around the rescue of animals from sites that were slated to be flooded for the creation of reservoirs. At first, this seems mildly amusing as we read about efforts to rescue monkeys and sloths and considerably less cuddly creatures like snakes, rodents, even spiders. But then we read about stranded cattle and other animals dying slow deaths. And worse, we realize that the military regime responded sometimes with more alacrity to threatened animal life than to threatened indigenous human life. Another feature that I deeply appreciated was Johnson's very deft handling of scientific explanations for some of the disasters wrought by the dams constructed during the dictatorship. I felt like he found the exact right balance between clear exposition and technical detail, so that I was able to pretty easily understand why reservoirs from dams in the Amazon were such a disaster in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Although I wonder whether run-of-the-river dams are the same kind of gas problem, or why a plague of Anopheles mosquitoes was eventually supplanted by the less lethal but perhaps more intolerable swarms of Mansonia mosquitoes. And at first, I was a little puzzled by Johnson's decision to foreground the Canudos massacre in the 1890s in his initial presentation of his argument. But over time, I came to appreciate the wisdom of that choice. I'll finish with a couple of questions. One has to do with the significance of motive or intentionality. One takeaway from this book, intended or not, is that the consequences of any major engineering project are very complex and to some extent unpredictable. At one point, Johnson acknowledges the contribution that non-Amazonian dams made to reducing greenhouse gases and thereby at least somewhat mitigating global warming. But he notes correctly that this wasn't something that the military did on purpose or intentionally. To what extent is this a useful way to approach the issues at hand? Some environmental issues are completely straightforward, but given the enormous complexity of these projects, can we imagine, and many environmental projects, and the many factors that are unforeseeable, can we imagine an indigenous organization or environmentalist group demanding something that could end up backfiring, even with the best of intentions? So our intentions always a good, a useful category of analysis. Then moving to a more contemporary context, I wonder to what extent we want to make such a clear distinction between what rights can be asserted under a dictatorship versus a democracy. Given the hollowing out of democracy in so many societies these days, the US, I think, above all, is there an argument to be made for democracy being perhaps even a worse political context for certain kinds of grassroots initiatives or protests, since it provides the veneer, the window dressing of popular approval? The military could never claim that even with all their campaigns for popular support, that their projects, and they never really cared to claim that their projects were supported by the Brazilian people. Or no, and nobody paid much, gave that serious attention. Dam building ebbed after the end of the dictatorship, but might not that have been a response, as you mentioned, Matthew, to over a decade of economic recession and the rise of the neoliberal order? Obviously, he's right to emphasize the constraints on popular protest, whether pro-indigenous or environmental, during the dictatorship. I love the fact that the actual engineers in 1989 derisively referred to yet another pharaonic dam, which they could not have done, I think, during the dictatorship. But how does that compare to the consequences of the neoliberal juggernaut and perhaps more important, something never referred to, which is gradual deindustrialization? What does the massive expansion of both large-scale cattle ranching and soybean farming imply for the issues analyzed in this book? But to go back to my original point, maybe the book could use a snappier title, but this is a really impressive accomplishment. Whenever I teach about the dictatorship in undergrad courses, I quote the usual grim statistics about the number of people in Brazil imprisoned, tortured, and disappeared by the military. In the past, those figures did not include the many indigenous people who were victims of the hubris and racism of the military regime. In the future, it will be impossible for me to omit that information, partly thanks to reading Matthew Johnson's book. That's it.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you. I'm
Barbara.
sorry. I forgot to ask how much time I had before I started talking. So I'm
As usual,
sorry if I
Barbara,
went
that
over.
was you were just perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now we welcome John McNeil. John McNeil knows something about mosquitoes. Right. So, as I was saying, I was going to answer one of Barbara's questions, the one about democracy. She asked, can democracy actually be even worse, environmentally speaking, than authoritarian systems? I'm going to answer it by paraphrasing Winston Churchill. Democracy is the worst of all possible political systems, except for all the others that have been tried from time to time. Okay. Now, it's usually a good idea to listen to John Tutino. That is one thing I have learned over the last 25 years. John apparently gave us detailed instructions about what we were to do in these presentations. I failed to notice those detailed instructions. So I prepared remarks that are targeted at both books simultaneously. And John just very recently told me to chop that up. So I'm going to chop it up and disentangle my remarks, but this means that this presentation is going to be even more incoherent than my usual standard and what many people in the audience are accustomed to. So, the first thing I want to say about Mark Johnson's book is that it was published in a series that I have co-edited for 20 years. And I want to make it as clear as I can and as public as I can that I recused myself entirely from the decision-making process and the editorial process. Matt submitted it, and that was the end of what I knew about it until the decision to publish it was made entirely by others. I had no idea who the readers were, and so on and so forth. That's a matter of principle, but I also want it to be recognized that the book was accepted by Cambridge University Press. The bar was not lowered on account of the fact that his PhD supervisor was part of the editorial team. That having been said, in some respects, I'm too close to the project to see it with a clear eye, but I will make a few remarks about it. And one of them, Barbara also alluded to, and I'm going to say approximately the same thing when I get to Seth's book, and that is the massive research effort behind this piece of work. 40 or more repositories in Brazil, Paraguay, and the US, archives, libraries. I don't think I've been to 40 archives and libraries in my entire life. I haven't ever tried to count it up, but I would be surprised if Matt didn't top me on his first book project. And then within that, what I regard as one of the hallmarks of Matt's research, because he's done the same thing on his second book project, and that is going outside of the conventional archival domain and getting into holdings that almost nobody has ever heard of and that are not open to the public and that you need to charm your way into. This has been a procedure entirely impossible for me. But Matt has done it again and again in Brazil and in several stops in the Caribbean. And I admire that it expands the range of archival harvest, getting engineers, activists, and so forth, people who lived the history that he brings to us, to speak to him and to share their papers with him.
And I'll get back to this theme when I turn to Seth's book, whenever that is permitted. The next thing I want to say is that both of these books have quite a bit in common as I see it. And one of those things is that they are about, among other things, quests by Brazilians to put Brazil in its proper place in the world and make it stronger, richer, more respected by the rest of humankind. And this is front and center in Matt's book. As I'll say in due course, it's also in Seth's book. And in both cases, it involved efforts to develop the interior, the backlands, Amazonia and elsewhere. In Matt's case, in a quest for cheap electrons, and in Seth's case, in a quest for cheap caffeine. Very loosely, both of these are efforts to energize Brazilian society. And they're both efforts to seek economies of scale. Most obviously in the massive size of the dams featured in Matt's book. I'll return to that again when I get to Seth's book. And then both books are Brazilian history transnationalized and in some respects globalized. In Matt's case, there's a lot in the book on dams in India and China and Egypt and elsewhere. There's the binational dam, Itaipu, and Matt, as best I could tell, did justice to the Paraguay side as well as to the Brazil side. And then, as he said in his talk, he was at pains to assess the significance of the Brazilian dam building enterprise in light of the ongoing climate crisis and the greenhouse gas significance, the global energy system significance of the dams built and the dams not built. That's a really important linkage. And as he was bold enough to say himself, nobody else has done it. I'm just confirming that fact. What he didn't say in his talk, that I think is also meritorious about it, is that he's explaining Brazil's dam building history in the context of what is sometimes called peak dam. The number of big dams built in the world peaked around 1980, right at the heart of the dictatorship's dam building surge. And part, although I think it's only a small part, of the reason that dam building peaked is because of the pushback and reputation that the Brazilian dams provoked. There are other reasons too, some of them connected to the availability of really good dam building sites. And another meritorious aspect of the work that Matt didn't bring up today is the consideration of the dictatorship's dam building program in the context of the trans-ideological appeal of dam building between the 1940s and 1990s. So as he says in the book, whatever your ideology, if you ran a state, you wanted to build big dams. You could be a communist, you could be a capitalist, you could be anything, but you wanted to build big dams. And part of the reason for that is the showcase aspect of them, to demonstrate the vitality and therefore legitimacy of the state. But on top of that, and the Brazilian case, as Barbara emphasized, underscores this all too well, part of it is the unsurpassed suitability of gigantic dam construction projects for kickbacks and corruption. You cannot have a better enterprise if you want to siphon money out of public projects and put them in your own pockets. So for those of you who have that in your set of ambitions, big dams, is what you want to do. I've got a couple of questions for both authors, and I'll end my remarks oriented towards Matt's book with these two questions, but then I'll repeat them again for Seth. So, Seth, you might want to take notes here because this is coming your way. And the first one is a question that I like to ask any author whose book is a few months or a few years in the rearview mirror, and that is, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently? Have you had any change of heart or change of mind about any non-trivial components of your book? And then the second thing, which could be related, but it might not be, is in the research marathon that you undertook, and both these authors did that, what was your greatest disappointment, frustration, setback? Every book has one of these, or 10, and I'd like to hear you answer that question. So that's it for me on Matt Johnson's, and I'll see you again shortly when we talk about Seth's.
Thank you very much, John. Matt, can you come on back up? We'll give you just a couple of minutes to answer. You have 4 questions before you. If you can answer them very briefly. It's up to John Tutino. What do you think? Okay, yeah. Well, why don't you take 5 minutes to answer the questions, then we'll see what the timing is like, see if we have any questions. Yeah. We would love to do that. It's largely up to you. So, yeah. We can always cut the break. That's I will not permit that. All right, go ahead, Matt.
Thank you. Well, I tend to talk quickly, so this, it's well within my ability to speed through this. First, I just want to say just a huge thank you to Barbara and John as well. It's really an honor to hear these comments. It really means a lot. So thank you so much for taking the time to read and for offering such a thoughtful reflection. I've written some notes here. Let me see if I can return to the questions. Significance of motive. It's certainly something I've thought about before, this idea of unintended consequences and our intentions, a good category of analysis. I think they are, but not alone, right? I think I think everyone in the room that's in academics and higher education and that sort of in the business of deepening knowledge, I think we all understand that motives are important. But there are unintended consequences, and that's why it's important to learn from history and from past experience, right? Because the more experience you have, the better you're able to sort of weather those unpredictabilities. So that's in part really gets to the heart of my motivations for doing history and being a historian is trying to deepen the knowledge base as much as possible about unintended consequences and about what we can learn from different settings on that front. So second question was, is there an argument about democracy can be even worse? John has already answered that. I will endorse that one. The thing I will add, though, because this is a question I've thought about, since finishing this project, people have asked me a lot, especially when I was asked to take on this authoritarian environmentalism debate sort of more head on, which was not in my sort of original vision. I think the authoritarian, democratic spectrum is important, but I also think it matters what the ideology of that regime is, right? A right-wing military government is much different than a left-wing military government, just as one example, right? So I think there are other factors that are important, and I personally have not seen any evidence, especially from the Brazilian case, that the dictatorship again was somehow better than a democratic system. And that's not to say that I was talking about this yesterday with colleagues and was asked about the continuity into the parliamentary democracy period in Brazil and cases like the Belo Monte Dam, where there was controversies. And I gave the example of Belo Monte, right? That was originally planned to have 2 giant reservoirs, and it was built as a run of the river dam, which means no reservoir, less power for that, but less impacts. And so for the indigenous people there, that wasn't enough. It didn't matter. It was still bad. There was corruption. Right, you could see a lot of continuities, but you also saw ruptures in terms of the democratic response and the pushback on that. So I think it's I guess the short answer to this is that I think it's sort of ad hoc debate. I don't think there's sort of a sweeping answer, but I found no evidence that authoritarianism is sort of better for democracy across the board yeah than democratic systems. All right, John's questions. What would I what would I have done differently, or have I changed my mind about anything? So there's one thing that I thought about pretty quickly actually after I published this, and it's subtle but it's important. Structure wise, I'm pretty happy with everything research, but it occurred to me that someone might pick up this book, read it, and say, well, so much for low carbon energy. Let's just, these projects are, I thought this was good, and here you're telling me that dams are low carbon energy is bad, so maybe we shouldn't do this, right? And there's a line in the conclusion that says very clearly and explicitly that that's not my takeaway, right? That's not my takeaway is that, as we do this, assuming that this project is important and will go forward to decarbonize the energy system, that we should do so mindfully and learn from the past history for this. But I don't know if I made that explicit enough. I think had I had the chance to rewrite this conclusion, I may have turned that into a whole paragraph or two rather than just a sentence to try to make it really clear to readers that I'm in no way trying to delegitimize the push for low carbon energy. In fact, quite the opposite. My goal is to try to help encourage and maintain the political momentum for decarbonization. And I think an important part of that is being real and candid about the environmental impacts that come with alternative energy systems, understanding from the history to understand some of these unintended consequences, the nuances, what makes the dam good or bad, what are the motives of people building it, who is bearing the impacts, who's not, et cetera, as all part of the effort to make that transition as just as possible. Research, greatest disappointment. I honestly feel pretty lucky. I mean, there were a bunch of setbacks along the way, of course, but I think the single biggest one was the Itaipu Dam. I had the hardest time getting access to sources to. There was essentially 3 state companies that built the dams that I looked at. 2 of them were much more forthcoming because Itaipu is binational and because it's sort of so iconic in Brazil as this showcase project. They were very reluctant to turn over records, so I had a much harder time in getting that. Thankfully, because it's binational, I had access to the Paraguayan side, so I knew who the librarian was there, and I showed up and said, "Hello, I'm here to see," and she let me in and was able to get some access through that. But that was by far the most difficult archive to get into.
Thank you very much, Matt. Time for, let's say, 2 questions from the audience. We have Professor de Groot, and over here as well, yeah. No, go ahead. I didn't realize you had the mic set up there.
Thank you. Is this, yeah, okay. Matt, this is just amazing stuff, as always. I have a question about one of your takeaways for the lessons of your history for these kind of big low carbon energy projects, right? So you mentioned that one of the things we really ought to do is have good assessments, I guess, good environmental assessments, so we can figure out the damage that can be wrought, right? But one of the big problems, as you know, in building low carbon anything is these environmental assessments. They enormously slow things down, raise the cost, and actually ultimately destroy the political support and the public support for projects. In just so many different cases, California, where you're from, the ultimate example right now, probably, right? So what is the correct middle ground?
Hi. So I didn't read the book yet, but I will. Uh, I was just very curious about because corruption in Brazil is such a big thing, political thing, and it's big enough to bring down governments. I was wondering if you found evidence of proof of corruption in one of these dam buildings. Yeah, that's it.
It's good to see you. And I would like to say that I am very glad because I put a very little point in your formation when I invite you to go to my house and to live with my family. It was wonderful to live with you. And I'm very, very happy to stay here and to see this book and this wonderful work. I'd like to ask you one curiosity. What do you think is more harmful on the ecological and social costs of hydroelectric plants, and on the other side, the cost of the equivalent oil and the carbon you can use for produce energy? Because we are talking about the ecological, the social, the problems with the hydroelectric plant. And if you can imagine that, on the other hand, we have to produce carbon and the oil in the same amount to produce the same energy. What's more harmful for the humanity and the society?
Great. Thank you so much for those questions. I'll answer the one about corruption first because I think I can answer both Wilson and Dagmar's together. So yeah, the corruption, absolutely. And I should note that I'm trying to remember the full name of the author. In any case, I've drawn on some other authors for that discussion, that part of the book about the construction companies and the corruption. But I absolutely did find cases that were documented among the big engineering firms, especially. There were a few cases with kickbacks that are well documented, and the book's floating around. I'll look it up and give you more details about them. As far as the other two questions, so. Dagmar, I've thought about this a lot in the last 24 hours, especially because I was asked this question yesterday. And but it's I mean, it's important, and that's again, it gets to both of the questions. I think get to my answer to John's question about what would I have done differently, and how would I have tackled this on. Um, and I'm still working towards what I think is a satisfactory answer. But again, I think so much of it just comes down to like a project by project ad hoc basis. I mean, I don't think I don't think there's an equivalency between this is personally, this is outside the scope of the research of the book, but I mean, between an affluent community worried about the siting of a wind farm offshore, right, is to me different than an indigenous group, flooding their entire land with their spiritual and economy, spiritual beliefs and economy are tied to that, right? Those are so my point again, my what I would do differently, right, is to try to not tell the narrative that we shouldn't do any low carbon projects because they're going to impact someone. Um, so uh, yeah, I'm working towards a satisfactory answer on that, but I do think it comes from the collective effort to deepen knowledge on this, and also to yeah, just deepen respect for communities that have been impacted by some of these projects in the past, right? Whether that's past communities that have been impacted by uranium mining, or other other communities that have been on the front lines, and to to sort of respect that trauma and do the best we can to alleviate it. And it also ties in with one of the main points of the book, which is getting to the level of detail about not just motives but also ideology, right? I think there's the inclusion. It's not just are dams good or bad, but it's what makes a dam good or bad. And in this case, right, a right-wing military government that did nothing to, that completely glossed over them and didn't compensate indigenous people, is a lot different than a dam built otherwise. So I think there's going to have to be compromises to be made, but I think those compromises can be best made with informed judgment. So, Wilson, as far as your question, yeah, I think unquestionably the fossil fuel regime is worse, right? And that's and again, what I would have maybe explained in those two paragraphs had I added them, is that the same communities that are impacted by dams would and will be impacted by a changing climate. If the world hits 3, 4, or 5 degrees Celsius, God forbid, that's going to disrupt the weather systems and have impacts also. So I think the point, again, dovetailing with Dagomar's question, to me isn't to assess these things in the crude trade-offs. I think dams sort of went out on that despite their trauma, but to highlight that there are still communities impacted, right? And that not only if we want to build a more just world do we have to account for that, but also there's going to be a backlash. To John's point about peak dams, I think it's correct. Globally, it was more about dam siting, but that picture I had up in the Amazon, I mean, that's very much the case. The Amazon is a region where the environmental impact did stall a lot of projects explicitly. So I think there's also a sort of a self-interest in that in terms of maintaining the momentum for decarbonization. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Matt. And thanks to all of you. And let's now avail ourselves of some refreshments. John Tutino, last word? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody. Yeah. Well done. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. Hope you've all had an opportunity to caffeinate quickly. Sadly, we do not have Guaraná for you here today. Neither the. It's an outrage. Yes. But even better than Guaraná, we do have Professor Seth Garfield from University of Texas, Austin. So welcome back, everybody, to our event, Ecology, Power, and Culture in Brazil, New Perspectives, here for our second session, Guaraná, the world's most caffeine-rich plant. And we have the most esteemed expert on that caffeine-rich plant with us here today, Seth Garfield from University of Texas, Austin. And once again, we will have comments from Barbara Weinstein and John McNeil. Thanks again to everybody, and over to Seth.
Okay, thank you, Brian. And first, I wanted to express my heartfelt gratitude for the invitation to present my work here today. The Georgetown University Americas Forum, the Environmental History Workshop, the Georgetown Americas Institute, John Tutino, John McNeil, and Barbara Weinstein, who offered graciously to comment on my work. I also wanted to give a shout out to Matt Johnson for your excellent work that I also had to read as part of this event, but I think it is the definitive work on this topic and will remain so for many, many years to come. So thank you for sharing that. So my book, Guaraná, How Brazil Embraced the World's Most Caffeine-Rich Plant, it answers a big question, which is how did a plant that nurtured the Satré-Maué people from the lower Amazon region for centuries, and which for centuries was basically known mainly in the center west and the Amazonian regions of Brazil. How did it become the ingredient of a multi-billion-dollar soft drink industry in Brazil, an icon of Brazilian national identity, like a food stuff that's part of everyday consumption and sociability in Brazil? And how can the social life of this thing illuminate broader histories of change, continuity, and power in society? So as historians of food, and I'm adding on drugs here as well, because Guaraná is a food and a drug, how these histories, which are marked by cultural exchanges, adaptations, they can illuminate well the shifting meanings that are ascribed to goods by different social groups, the spaces and structures that link production and consumption, and the varied webs of signification and power in society. And for this forum, I think we're talking a lot about uses, understandings of the natural environment, and how studying Guaraná and how different actors have approached, understood, utilized this plant, this drug, this commodity, we get a larger overview of what I wanted to call, as the title of my book, A Taste of Brazil, but which the publisher would not allow me. And I learned that Matthew had a similar experience, actually. And I thought the play on words was quite effective because it is a taste, it's a food that's very much distinct to Brazilian diet and sociability, as I mentioned. But I'm also using it as a projection of the nation's history because the book sprawls several centuries, going from pre-Columbian times to the 21st century. So there are two main lines of inquiry in the book. The dominant one is the one in blue. It explores how a plant intrinsic to Satré-Maué kin-based systems and world-making was re-signified by a host of historical actors and processes. So the exchange, the classification, and accumulation that took place through these new networks of state expansion, scientific experimentation, and capitalist development, and all the different actors that were involved in this. So this is a connective history that's bringing together links between or among ecology, culture, and power. So just to situate ourselves here, Guaraná is native to the lower Amazon region, between the borders of Pará and Amazonas state. The larger gray area are the areas of traditional cultivation of Guaraná, and the dark gray areas are the current day indigenous reservations of the Satré-Maué people who first domesticated Guaraná. So Guaraná grows as a vine when it grows wild. The indigenous people recognizing the analeptic or the energizing qualities of the plant and wanting access to those berries. Guarana has 2 to 5 times the amount, the berries have 2 to 5 times the amount of caffeine as Arabica coffee beans, right? So wanting access, they cultivated the plant so that it grows more like a shrub. They also developed very sophisticated techniques to smoke the plant, the derivative of the plant, so that it would not be prone to spoilage and fermentation in the Amazon. And they also developed very distinctive ways of preparing and drinking the plant. So it's only prepared by the women, that's shown in the right-hand side of the slide. It's rasped into cold water. It's consumed unsweetened. It was also very quickly adopted by non-indigenous peoples of the Amazon. So the Pirarucu tongue on the left was not the traditional instrument that the indigenous people used. They used a rock, a particular stone, but the smoked, that on the right is the smoked Guarana loaf, bastão, or baton, as it traditionally circulated in the Amazon region. Now, if you ask most Brazilians today who don't live in the Amazon, and even many who live in Amazonian cities, what that is, they would never be able to tell you that that's Guarana, because it's not known that way, right? But it's more than a comestible for the indigenous populations. It's a metaphysical object. It has metaphysical importance. So the indigenous peoples, the Satere-Mawe, believe that they are descendants of the Guarana berry. So in the indigenous myth, a Satere-Mawe child is murdered by his uncles, and his mother dismembers his body and plants his eyeballs in the ground. The Guarana berry looks very much like an eyeball. So they believe that the first ancestor who came from this berry, from this eyeball, as did the Guarana shrub. And it has all sorts of importance in terms of therapeutics, socializing, cultural dimensions of day-to-day life of the Satere-Mawe. They believe that ingesting the beverage brings goodwill, health, conciliation within the community. So this is a far cry from what will happen to Guarana in the 20th century. So I worked a lot with advertising, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, I'll share with you some of those early advertisements. But now Guarana is celebrated very much as a Brazilian original, something that's authentically Brazilian. You see on the left, the advertisements from the 1930s and 40s, that Companhia Antártica was already working with this idea of a very nationalistic product, that it came from the Amazon, the fruit, and therefore the soda was uniquely and distinctly Amazon, and they're Brazilian, and they're competing with Coca-Cola, so there's a real interest to show why this soda is authentic and better. So how can the social life of a thing illuminate broader histories? I'm working here with many big, large-scale histories of indigenous transformations of the natural environment, colonialism, nation-state formation. I'm working with industrialization, agricultural development, mass consumerism. So what I tried to do is to blend different approaches, cultural, environmental, indigenous. These are some of the histories that I tried to work with, the types of historical approaches that I tried to work with. But I also worked a lot with theorists from different disciplines. So from anthropology, Sidney Mintz being a trailblazer in the field of food studies and looking at how foods are, signify status and are instruments for membership building or belonging to communities. So looking at the social life of things and Apadurai's contributions and his fellow co-contributors, but also looking at anthropologists and ethnographers who work on the Amazonian peoples and also Amazonian ecologies to think about transformations in those ecosystems and the way native peoples relate to those ecosystems. Working with cultural theorists like Barth and ideas of semiotics and myth, because so much of the way Guarana has been marketed to consumers in Brazil conjures up ideas of romanticizations, idealizations, if you will, about the body, about nature, et cetera. Structuration, so working with sociologists, ideas about how day-to-day routines and pattern activities through which social actors reproduce the structural qualities of larger collectivities. So one of the things in working on this project, on this plant, on this soda, whatever you want to call it, I would often find myself thinking about, who cares? It's just a plant, it's just a soda. How can I make bigger claims about this? And when I came across across these Giddens ideas about structuration, I thought, actually there is something bigger to be said about, or through this story, because through this story, we were able to illustrate these social inequalities, these hierarchies, and how they're formed historically and evolve historically over time. And then from science and technology studies, Latour, for many reasons, because of the way he challenges the division between nature and culture, the way he looks at objects or actants and how they shape history, but also this idea of a symmetrical anthropology, in subjecting the belief systems and socioeconomic structures of modern populations, or so-called modern, to the analysis traditionally reserved for indigenous people. So to better illustrate that, I shared with you the indigenous myths about the origins of Guarana. But what about the so-called non-indigenous myths about the origins of Guarana? So this advertisement from the 1970s by the Brahma Soda Company, the translation actually reads, "Set free the forces of nature." This one is authentic. It still has the jungle in its soul. It remains pure, tied to its origins, and some a savage. Opening the bottle cap, and you're going to set free all of these instincts. Set free Guarana Brahma when you first feel thirsty, and appreciate the result. So this idea, this romanticization of nature, this exoticization of the Amazon, this shape-shifting object that's going to turn you into a, it's not only indigenous peoples that have these myths about nature and about foods. So I'm going to do a brief summary of the chapters as Matt did, because it's a sprawling book. So to give you an idea of what I tried to cover here, I'm just going to summarize like what each chapter tried to do. So in the first chapter, The Roots of History and Myth, this situates the historical origins of Guarana in pre-Columbian Amazonian ethnobotany and historical ecology. And it deals with the strategic modification of Amazonian landscapes and the management of forest resources by indigenous peoples, as evidenced by the prevalence of Amazonian black earths. So black soils, terra preta, in the Amazon, scientists believe that this derives from the concentration of carbon in the soil, which owes to charcoal and human waste, charcoal for food preparation, for pottery, pointing to histories of sedentarization and large-scale concentration of populations. And as part of that sedentarization, indigenous people planted medicinal plants, foodstuffs, ornamental plants, utilitarian plants that transform the ecology and the environment of the Amazon. So it's William Bellet who talks about cultural forests, that the indigenous peoples, centuries before, millennia before the Europeans arrived, were transforming the environment. The chapter also highlights the indigenous rituals and beliefs, as I alluded to in the beginning of the presentation, that were associated with the planting, the harvesting, and the consumption of guarana, and the traditional role of the beverage in structuring community norms and mediating disputes. And later in the book, I say that guarana actually also structures norms and mediates disputes in dominant Brazilian society because of the way it enters as a beverage that's more suitable for women and for children, and looking at the way it was sort of served to reconcile contradictions or tensions in that society that came about with modernization, with urbanization, and changing roles in the household. So the second chapter, Colonial Missions, Remaking Plants and People, looks at the writings of one particular individual, João Felipe Bettendorf, a Jesuit, so very fitting for my host institution today. And this is the first the oldest written European description of guarana. It dates from the late 17th century. It's a very terse reference about its therapeutic effects, how it's a diuretic, for example, and how it serves to ward off sleep. So its physical impact was certainly recognized at the time. But the chapter reflects more broadly on the origins and the impact of Guarana's insertion into Western networks of trade, knowledge, and power that emerged with the expansion of imperialism, the expansion of the church, and the globalization of science. So this is a Jesuit recipe book from 1766. And the Jesuits and the Portuguese world in general were critical in the dissemination of medical knowledge and of plants during the early modern period because of their transnational, transcontinental presence. And so I see how Guarana is we already are seeing the beginnings of these transformations of how Guarana is being described, and the beginning of the erasure of indigenous knowledge, because Bettendorf's reference to Guarana makes no comment about the indigenous understandings of the plant, how it played into their cosmologies. I mean, you might think that wouldn't be too much of a surprise, I guess, if he's a Jesuit, he really wants to kind of erase that or suppress it. But there's no mention of it, so we're already beginning to see how it's being resignified. So the next chapter, Silva Coutinho's plan, 19th century science and Amazonian politics or geopolitics. This focuses on the national agenda of João Martins da Silva Coutinho. He's the gentleman in the back right-hand corner. He was a military engineer, and he was assigned to be the guide of Harvard zoologist Luiz Agassiz and his wife Elizabeth to the Brazilian Amazon in 1865, 1866, and they wrote this very well-known book called Journey in Brazil. But Silva Coutinho's role in this story is much less well-known. So while Luiz Agassiz was interested in collecting specimens for his museum, proving theories about degeneration due to racial intermixture, and rebutting theories about natural selection, those were his and opening up the Amazon to commerce from other nations. We could say that Silva Coutinho, as an 19th century Brazilian scientist linked to the nascent scientific institutions of the time, and to the Brazilian imperial geopolitical project, was more interested in developing the Amazon and learning more about the region, about its flora, its fauna, and its peoples. He was particularly interested in Guaraná, and so he wrote the first full-length study that I came across from the 1860s, which profiled many aspects of Guaraná's cultivation and its commerce. And so why was he so interested in Guaraná? So Guaraná, he said, was the heart of the commerce on the Madeira and the Tapajós rivers, which are two major tributaries of the Amazon River that flow north from Mato Grosso. And Mato Grosso was a problematic region for Brazil, for the central government. It was only tenuously linked to the centers of economic and political power. At the time, it had been invaded by Paraguay during the War of the Triple Alliance. So Silva Coutinho, as a military engineer, thinking about the broader colonization and geopolitical projection of Brazil, believed that Guaraná could serve as an agent of national integration. And why so? Because first of all, it was a cultivated crop. So unlike the forest commodities that were extracted and that led to more itinerant lifestyles, he believed that Guaraná offered a model for a sort of commercial agriculture and a sedentarization of the Amazonian workforce and rural population. It was also cultivated by the Satere Maué. And Silva Coutinho was an early indigenista, you could say, because he spoke about the potential of native peoples for a labor force, defense of the Amazon. So there was this idea that the indigenous peoples, they were backward, they were superstitious, they had these myths. And he's the first one that records that myth that I mentioned to you. But that they could be redeemed by science, through statecraft, through education. So chapter 4 takes a bit of a geographic detour because of the documents that I found, and it looks at the fleeting popularity of Guaraná in late 19th century Anglo-American pharmacy and therapeutics. One of my big surprises, which might not make me too popular among Brazilians, was that the first soda of Guaraná soda was actually created in the United States in the 19th century because it was part of a patent medicine, like many sodas. So some company, I think in St. Louis, Missouri, was already marketing, not of course in the scale and the nature or in the taste of what would become the well-known Guaraná sodas in Brazil. But it had entered into the pharmaceutical industry in the United States. So I'm looking at the acquisition and dissemination of knowledge about Guaraná by Western scientists, and how 19th century scientists reclassified Guaraná according to universal standards of botany and chemistry. Caffeine is first discovered, I think, in the 1820s, but certainly beginning of the 19th century. So these advances in chemistry, in botany, the way in which plants are now going to be classified according to the binomial nomenclature established by Carl Linnaeus, and how European chemists are identifying active principles. So they identify the active principle of Guaraná as caffeine. They rename Guaraná Paullinia cupana, which is its scientific name. So, and they prescribe it for interesting types of diseases like neurasthenia or nervous exhaustion, because it was a tonic. So it's supposed to energize the blood and the sinews and the muscles, etc. And interestingly, neurasthenia was supposed to be a disease that only affected more educated and cultured individuals because it was too much overload on their minds, the frenzied pace of modernity. So this medicament, this food that it was so intrinsic to Satere Mawe lifestyles was, deemed irrelevant to them in this medical literature because they would never suffer from neurasthenia, if you will. So I also look at why this aspect of history has been erased. And it's because, well, many of these plant-based medicines are no longer prevalent, of course, in Western medicine, or as in this form, I should say. But it was also the high cost of guarana relative to other sources of caffeine, the barriers in supply, and the advent of synthetic analgesics, which like aspirin, that limited its export capacity. So the title of this chapter, From Guarani to Guarana, I owe a great deal of gratitude to my colleague, Brian McCammon. This is the title of a samba from the early 1930s. I learned about it when I first read his book. So I always had that in the back of my head. And it's looking at the forging of a national industry. So here, this photo of the Antarctica factory. Antarctica made much more money with its beers. It still makes more money from beers than from its sodas and agua tonicas and stuff like that. But this chapter looks at the rise of the soft drink industry, the beverage industry in Brazil, which was linked to increased urbanization, industrialization, domestic manufacture. So carbonated beverages were first launched in Europe and the United States during the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century. But in Brazil, the domestic manufacture dates to the early 20th century. So for this chapter, I wanted to profile specific individuals, these actors who had very historical actors that had important roles in the story. So I looked at Brazilian pharmacists like Jesus Gomes, who gave us Guaraná Jesus in Maranhão in 1927, and whose son or grandson wrote a very interesting biography. He ended up he was like a socialist, and he left all his money. The family became fabulously wealthy from the soda, but upon his death, he wanted all his money left to the Communist Party. And Luis Pereira Barreto, who was a prominent physician and positivist. He was also a journalist for one of the São Paulo newspapers. He devised a method to extract the syrup from guaraná seeds that would be used by the Companhia Antártica Paulista. He was also a prolific writer, a fierce nationalist. He was very much adamant in pursuing and supporting, advancing the industrialization of Brazilian society. So there was like a political project beyond his, money-making intentions. But he was a very ardent nationalist. So he spoke about the importance of Brazil industrializing as a path to becoming a modern nation. As a doctor, he was also a fierce opponent of alcohol consumption and was a member or was influential in the temperance movement. So in the United States, in Brazil, and presumably elsewhere where temperance movements took off, soft drinks and sodas were key instruments for countering, if you will, alcohol and offering a different type of beverage for sociability and a better beverage that was more, would contribute to abstemiousness and less dissolute forms of behaviors. This chapter also looks at Amazonian elites because another interesting thing that I discovered in the research that for many, many years, soda manufacturers did not actually use guaraná in the product. It was very expensive and it was hard to obtain. So they falsified. They used other types of caffeine, other types of products. So Amazonian traders were aware of this. They were horribly outraged. They felt they were being ripped off and once again being taken advantage of by outsiders within Brazil. So this fraud, it caused a campaign by Amazonian traders and producers in the name of consumer protection that lasted for decades to ensure that there would be a minimum guaraná content for all of these beverages. And this was codified in national legislation finally in 1972. So by law, all beverages that have guaraná in their title have to have a certain minimum, a small minimum of guaraná in them. And most of the beverage companies now adhere to this policy. If I have time, and I might not, so I might have to skip the deeper dive into this chapter. This was the chapter that looks a lot at advertisement and how this how Guaraná was sold to Brazilian consumers. Because one of the points that historians of drugs have made is, yes, they have psychoactive impact. There's a real rush that people get from caffeine, although Guaraná soda has very little caffeine in it, but it has sugar, it has carbonate. There are things that are appealing to the palate, if you will, and to the brain in this beverage. So it's masterfully kind of engineered. So we should never diminish like the physical qualities of the food and how that has an importance. But moving beyond that, it's the ideas that were surrounding Guaraná. So I look at, in particular, at images of gender and ethnicity and also generation, because in this early marketing of Guaraná, you have emphasis on women as consumers because hard alcohol was stigmatized for consumption by women, right? So this becomes a beverage that's more acceptable for the modern woman. And the modern household doesn't have homemade juices or water, it has soda. It's because this is an industrial product. So it's very much linked to this idea of modernization in Brazilian society, but also reaffirming or re-signifying in many ways, or reconfiguring, I should say, women's, middle-class women, elite women's traditional roles as homemakers. So now the modern woman is still overseeing her servants, or modern upper class woman is still overseeing her servants, but the servants are serving or she's buying for the household. These sodas bring energy, and this whole emphasis on energy for being critical for the modern citizen and strength and power. And a lot of these sodas had endorsements from medical doctors, from health officials, as being something that brought vitality. So this chapter, Growing the Pie, which was referred to in Matt's presentation, here there's a lot of overlap, not only in indigenous histories, but in modernization of the countryside, in transformations in rural production, and actually on the populations of the countryside. So this links the expansion of agricultural production of Guaraná in Brazil to corporate, university, and governmental research on plant genetics and biotechnology in the context of the military government's geopolitical project for agricultural modernization and Amazonian development. So it focuses on the modernization of Guaraná production, and which is intertwined with the increase in agribusiness, the increased consumption of soft drinks as Brazil's population becomes more urbanized, right? And as they're able to buy more things, and overnutrition. The chapter explores the transformations in agriculture and in diet, which were symptomatic of the Green Revolution and the nutrition transition in developing countries. So this institutionalized agricultural research was carried out under the military government, under the auspices of the Brazilian Agricultural Research Company, Embrapa, which, wrought a revolution in terms of soybean cultivation in Brazil, right? Probably the most famous case. But they were also involved in studies of Guaraná, how to selectively breed more disease-resistant plants, more productive, more caffeine-rich plants. So, alongside this, we witnessed the nutritional transition in Brazil, which was linked to the increase of ultra-processed foods characterized by an excess of simple carbohydrates, such as soft drinks, that have been implicated in the increase of obesity and overweight, and in the prevalence of morbidity and mortality due to chronic diseases and degenerative diseases, as aside from undernutrition or environmentally linked diseases. So this chapter highlights agroecological change and the changing technical capabilities, social roles, and ideologies that converge in food systems. And it also highlights the reconfiguration of identities, individual and collective, that have been tied to the expansion of commercial markets under the military government. We know there was a great expansion of consumerism in Brazil during the military period, and alongside that come new identities as consumers of products, of goods. That Eric Hobsbawm in his book on the 20th century talks about stars and cans, and how in much of the developing world, the icons that people much of the developed world and the developing world, the larger cities, that the icons that they begin to identify with are famous, actors, athletes, but also products like cans, like soda, etc. This chapter, the last chapter, it borrows this concept of indigenization of modernity from anthropologist Marshall Solins, who looked at indigenous adaptations that diversified a world unified by capitalism. So indigenous peoples have their own ways of being modern, and it explores how this Atremawe, I return to the originators of the plant, right? I come back to a story that's often left aside when people tried to reconstruct indigenous histories in Brazil. They often they traditionally disappeared in the colonial period. So I wanted to come back to the indigenous centered history at the end of this book. And it explores how they survived as a distinct ethnic group due to strategic alliances and selective adjustments of indigenous sociocultural norms to external influences. And Guaraná, since the beginning of the history, dating back to the colonial period, was emblematic in this process. So after 2 decades of Brazilian military regime rule, in which the regime promoted Amazonian development with very deleterious impact on indigenous communities, including the Satremawe, whose territory was invaded by a French oil company, which left destruction and deaths in the community. The Satremawe undertook a community development project to market native Guaraná, and it's pictured here on the right, in Europe through fair trade networks and the Slow Food Foundation. It sells at a very high price, much more than Guaraná, sells domestically, or powdered Guaraná in Brazil. And this Guaraná project, which was supported by an indigenous consortium, it challenged Embrapa, the Brazilian government's model of technoscience and the industrial food system like Guaraná Antarctica through traditional planting, cultivation, and preparation methods for Guaraná. The commercial project of the indigenous peoples emerged amid the expansion of the rights of indigenous peoples enshrined in the Brazilian Constitution of 1988, the rise of alternative food systems, and the global concern with deforestation of the Amazon that Matt also looked at in his presentation, while also striving to expand production and gain greater adherence from members of the Satremawe communities. And in the conclusion, I return to this idea of a Brazilian original, which is the way the product is marked. So in many ways, what I try to show here is that if we're thinking about the history of soft drugs, Guaraná, such as coffee or chocolate or sugar, I guess, or tobacco, in many ways we see a similar massification, right, of a stimulant. But in other ways, Guaraná's history is somewhat different. It never achieves the global status of coffee so far. It doesn't achieve the global status of tea, let's say. And there are, reasons for this because of the production, the scale of production, distribution, challenges with transportation, and competition from those other established stimulants, right, that are more familiar to global consumers. In return, though, we have the celebration of this authenticity of Guaraná as something that's distinctly Brazilian. And some of the ads are kind of interesting too, because this idea that by drinking Guaraná, that makes you, of course, Brazilian. It makes you original, even though millions of other people are doing the exact same thing that you're doing. So it's not that original at all, but it's the sort of the mixed messaging that comes with advertising. And I think I'm gonna stop here instead of going into the slides about the advertisements, because I'd like to leave time for the comment and the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Seth. And I can vouch for this. I've read both of these books thoroughly, of course, and Matt's I also read in the dissertation stage, but I had the opportunity to read Seth's thoroughly last year as we prepared for a session at the AHA, and it's a great book, so highly recommended. And once again, we have Barbara Weinstein.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I hope you won't mind me starting by saying that I do not want to take there to be a takeaway from my comments that I think dictatorships are better than democracy. I was saying very specifically, first of all, in terms of environmental issues, that I am not at all convinced that certain kinds of democracy wouldn't be even worse in terms of environmental issues. But I want to be very clear that Winston Churchill quote is very problematic because it assumes we know what a democracy is, and a democracy is a democracy. But Russia under Putin is putatively a democracy. No, the United States under Trump is putatively a democracy. But the public sphere is narrowing, the capacity to express opinions is narrowing. So I'm not talking about a binary, very bad dictatorship, very good democracy. I'm talking about the way in which the claim of democracy allows people in power the weapon, the very powerful weapon, sometimes more powerful than a gun, or even a prison cell, of saying the people are with me. I have been elected by the people, and therefore everything I do is correct. So that's the point I'm making. And Winston Churchill really didn't have much to say about that. I'm sorry. Um, Okay, so let me get to my comments about Seth's book, which are less relevant to what I just said. Um, Hold on just a second while I find where they are. There, okay. Okay, so I should start by saying that I have talked and thought a lot about this book. I sort of feel like I've said so much that probably I have no more to say. But mainly I want to say, first of all, what a great fan I am of Seth's work in general, and specifically of guarana, how Brazil embraced the world's most caffeine-rich plant. I'm sorry the publisher didn't let you use A Taste of Brazil, but the new title is pretty good too. So this book is a tour de force. While I knew something about Guaraná before reading this, I would not have imagined the many different ramifications and implications that could be drawn out of its history as a culturally and commercially significant plant. In doing a book on a topic like Guaraná, I think the challenge for Seth was to keep Guaraná at the center of his story, even as he sought to develop the story in a way that takes its significance beyond the specific history of Guaraná. He endeavors to do the latter by taking us in several different directions: the appropriation of indigenous knowledge by colonial actors, conflicting visions of the Amazon's past and future, the emergence of Guaraná as a quintessential Brazilian taste, the pleasures and pitfalls of sugary drinks and soft drugs, the role of authenticity in the global economy. Given how much ground that Seth covers, I cannot say that the research for this book is exhaustive, because that would mean he'd spend the next 30 years of his life doing archival digging. In other words, an author of this sort of book has to be selective, cannot be exhaustive in the use of both primary and secondary sources. And generally speaking, Seth's use of source material is both judicious and imaginative. This book is a remarkable achievement in so many ways, and one way that every historian can appreciate is the breadth and variety of sources that Seth employs. There are, of course, other books that deal with single commodities that originated or flourished in the Latin American context. Aside from Sidney Mintz's Sweetness and Power, which Seth mentions, there are some earlier commodity studies that share some of the themes in Guaraná. For example, Heidi Tinsman's Buying into the Regime and John Saluri's Banana Cultures. But in both of those books, the main consumers of the commodities, grapes and bananas respectively, are in the global market, and especially in North America. Guaraná is doubly distinctive for its attention to the indigenous roots of the Guaraná trade and its focus on the commodities trajectory within Brazil itself. Though, of course, Seth also discusses the various initiatives to make it a global commodity, and also discusses the internal regionalization of Brazilian commerce, which implies some separation between producer and consumer. Indeed, it's not really a commodity study in the usual sense, since Seth gives so much appropriate attention to non-commodified Guaraná. Among the many things that Seth's book accomplishes is to show the existence of a lively and distinctive consumer culture in Brazil long before the 20th century. I especially enjoyed the discussion of the localized mania for Guaraná in 19th century Mato Grosso. But I also wonder about the enduring connection drawn between the plant's indigenous roots in the Satare Maui communities and its anchoring in the Brazilian market. Why has Guaraná maintained that association with its indigenous roots in production as well as circulation, whereas goods such as tobacco and rubber, um, uh, despite cigar store Indians, quote unquote, aside, or the use of the term India rubber during the rubber boom by English speakers to refer to rubber from Brazil, there's sort of they had this initial connection with indigeneity, but then it gets completely lost. Is that about more massive production? Is that about marketing? Is that about globality? I'm wondering, Seth, if you have ever thought of doing a brief comparative study, it would be a fun article, of the trajectory of Guaraná and acai. When I first went to the Amazon, everyone in Brazil, all over Brazil, was already drinking Guaraná soda. But absolutely nobody, I mean, Irene, nobody outside of the Brazilian Amazon, to my knowledge, was eating acai. Though in the Amazon, everyone, when you walked into their home, was serving it with great pride. I couldn't bring myself to admit that I really didn't like it because it seemed it was so hospitable to be offered it that I ate a lot of acai. Um, and yet now acai has become ubiquitous. There's a shop hawking acai bowls on McDougal Street in Greenwich Village, and it appears almost daily in the New York Times crossword puzzle. But I don't think acai has been as warmly embraced nationally, that is, in Brazil, as Guaraná. And I wonder if it has to do with taste, if it has to do with health, that acai's success globally has to do with it kind of um, taking, sort of getting associated with the antioxidant craze. I want to end this short commentary on Seth's book by revealing a conversation I had with Seth when he was just starting to work on this book. He hasn't given me permission to reveal it, but I'm going to do so anyway. He asked me if I thought it would pigeonhole him too much to do yet another book based mainly in the Amazon. But I could already tell, and I thought about it and I could see his point, but I could already tell from his brief description that the book he had in mind was both about that he was really eager to do it, and it was both about the history and ecology of the Amazon in very important ways, but also about issues that stretched way beyond the region. And I also think that there is still so much we don't know about the Amazon and its history. Though one thing I want to note about both Matt Johnson's book and Seth Garfield's book is that if you look at their footnotes, you will see many references to unpublished theses and dissertations by Brazilian scholars, many of them based in Pará and Amazonas and other parts of the Amazon. And one of the, I think, major changes for people interested in the Amazon is precisely this new generation of mainly young scholars who are churning out important works about Amazonian history. And this is something, it's a phenomenon that really didn't exist. There were local historians, but academically trained historians working at universities practically didn't exist when I first started working on the Amazon. Anyhow, I could tell Seth really wanted to do this book, and I'm really glad I provided some reassurance that yes, he should do it, and we can all enjoy the results.
Thank you very much, Barbara. John McNeil.
You're welcome.
Okay.
So I want to begin where I promised I would begin and remind Seth of two initial questions that I'd like him to wrestle with when he gets the floor back again. One, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently? Have you had any change of mind or change of heart since this book was published? And you've had a little longer than Matt has had to have a change of mind or a change of heart. So I expect an even longer answer from you. And then your research effort was also a marathon, and I'll say a little bit about that in just a moment. What was the biggest frustration or setback along the way for you? So, as I told you before, I try to think about these books in parallel, and one of the things that they have in common is that massive research effort. In Seth's case, if I count correctly, 22 different repositories in 3 countries, over 100 different periodicals, over 120 different published primary source books. He used a provincial newspaper from the least populated province of New Zealand, Otago, where I lived once upon a time, so it leapt out at me. He used Sachs's New Guide or Hints to Soda Water Dispensers, published in 1898 in my hometown of Chicago. I'd be very surprised if any other history book ever written, and there have been millions, has used Sachs's New Guide or Hints to Soda Water Dispensers. I haven't checked, however. Seth also attempted what I regard as one of the most perilous high dives of scholarship in trying to bring to the printed page or to the digital text a worldview and Guarana's place within that worldview of the Satare Mawe, indigenous population of Amazon, especially in the early chapters. He relied on anthropologists, he relied on travelers' accounts for those early chapters. There's nothing else to go on, really. To try to imagine and to communicate a mentality that I expect is very different from the one he was socialized into. Not that I actually know anything about Seth's upbringing. And to me, this is perilous, both intellectually and politically. And I'd like to hear Seth talk about that process and whether or not it was anxiety producing. It looked to me like he did it with dexterity as well as courage, but I honestly wouldn't know. Although I will say, in one word of criticism, that I thought Seth learned too much from the anthropologists in this and wrote a few passages that I couldn't understand. Now, earlier I said that these 2 books also included a story of quests about Brazil's proper place in the world. And I talked about that a little bit for Matt's book. In Seth's book, it's consistent, at least in the repeated, that Guarani is conscripted for nationalist programs in Brazil from the early 20th century onward. And as best I can tell, it's still going on. And that's a constant refrain in the book. Seth talked about it a little bit here. To me, it's possibly the single most interesting thing in the book, how a plant and a product were so frequently, as I say, conscripted. There aren't that many parallels to that, as far as I'm aware. And then, as I said earlier, with respect to Matt's book, these quests also involved efforts to develop the interior, in this case, mainly Amazonia, in this case, mainly in a quest for cheap caffeine, but also a quest for, as I said before, economies of scale. And here, that really happens when people try to create Guarana plantations, which is something that Seth did not really talk about this afternoon, and I'm going to ask him in a minute or two to talk about. His, like Matt's book, is Brazilian history transnationalized and with comparative dimensions. And here, a lot of that is the career of Guaraná as a patent medicine, mainly in North America, and its participation, one might say, in the spread of agribusiness and industrial food systems, as Seth talked about this afternoon. And here, there are a lot of interesting parallels that Seth touches on in the book, but didn't talk about today, to Bart Elmore's book about Coca-Cola, which some of you have read. And I was thinking about how interesting it would be to teach those books side by side one day. Okay, here are my remaining questions for Seth. And first about the transnational component. So Guaraná's first external career as a patent medicine, not to say snake oil, is mainly anchored in the USA. The post-1990 external career as a fair trade health food seems mainly to involve France and Italy. I didn't understand why. Is this just random, or is there some reason why its initial career is mainly in the United States, if I've understood it correctly, and its second career transnationally is mainly in Europe, and only 2 countries in Europe? The data Seth gives about that show that France and Italy totally dominate the market for importing this as a health food. So that was curious to me. Secondly, about the plantations. So in the talk and in the book, Seth refers now and again to coffee, tea, sugar, and tobacco, soft drugs. All those 4 have very lengthy, widespread, and distinguished careers as plantation crops. Guaraná doesn't really do that. And I asked Seth to summarize for us this afternoon, why not? Is this an ecological matter? Is it a market matter? Is it some other kind of matter? Why doesn't it have that distinguished plantation career? Now a couple of craft questions, and then I'll be done. 2 of the chapters, I think it's chapters 2 and 3, are built largely around individuals, that Jesuit, Bettendorf, and then the gentleman engineer, Silva Coutinho. No other chapters follow this model, although chapter 5 is built around 2 entrepreneurial types, but they don't dominate the chapter as much as either Bettendorf or Silva Coutinho. So I'm wondering about your choices here. Why did you do as you do? Did you discard some other rival models for organizing your chapters? I have nothing against inconsistency. It is the hobgoblin of little minds, according to some serious intellectuals, but I'm curious about this. And then my last craft question, and it's really a vocabulary question, and it pertains mainly to the first couple of chapters. Seth uses as verbs appropriate and circulate and exchange when referring to the uptake of Guaraná by non-indigenous populations. And I'm wondering about the choice of these words and whether they really mean something to you. Is there a distinction you're trying to draw sometimes between appropriation and exchange? Or are they essentially interchangeable? I couldn't tell because all 3 are in regular use in the early chapters. Okay, so those are my 4 questions for Seth beyond the initial 2. So he's got 6. Let's see if he really wants to wrestle with them all.
That's quite a challenge. Yeah, come on up, Seth. Well, I'm afraid you have to, yes. Thank you so much, John McNeil, and over to you, Seth.
So thank you, Barbara and John, for those excellent questions and comments. I really appreciate them. I think I have answers for most of them, but you're making me work here, I have to say. So the first, I'll get to this more specific questions before reflecting on regrets or what I might have done differently. So the transnational circuit, no, so that's a little bit misleading. That final chapter is getting back to the indigenous production of guarana, and so that's very much focused on their production of that commodity and how it's traded within those fair trade networks. But it would be misleading to think that the soda, the more famous iteration and the more lucrative one, does not also trade internationally. In fact, Guarana Antarctica has factories in Japan and Portugal, and now in the United States, I found out, in New York, where they plan to distribute those drinks to consumers in these countries. So they're trying to they have broken into some of these markets. So it's not that it doesn't have a transnational reach, or that, the first transnational iteration would actually be with the Portuguese, because we have documents from trade records from the late 18th, early 19th century that Guaraná is being sent over in these Portuguese ships back to Lisbon. So that would technically be the first, transnational, I guess, distribution. But the more dominant form of transnational circulation, I would say, are the sodas, which are produced now in those other countries outside of Brazil. Oh, and Bolivia too, I believe, also has a factor. The second question about plantation crops. So the chapter on Silva Coutinho ends that his big dream to implant or to deepen commercial agriculture in the Amazon is stymied by the skyrocketing of the rubber and extractive industry in the Amazon. So in many ways, the Amazonian elites always face the challenge to finding willing or ample labor. The economy it revolves around rubber from the late 19th century up until the end of the rubber boom. And so Guaraná loses out the same way it will continue to lose out in the 20th century to other crops or commodities that are more lucrative, that are produced in bigger scale now, like soybeans or cattle or mining, not agriculture. But so these extractive industries always trump the Guaraná production, which, although there are Guaraná plantations now in the Amazon and in Bahia, which is now the leading producing state of Guaraná, so it's transplanted outside of the Amazon, it's still very much a small farmer's crop. So the fact that it's a small farmer's crop made it difficult for me to find documentation about production conditions surrounding production. So I guess I'm jumping ahead here, but what would I have liked to have done differently about the book? I would have liked to have learned more about small producers of the crop, not just indigenous producers, but the non-indigenous producers. For more recent history, we have some studies about that, but not dating back earlier in the 20th or the 19th centuries. And I couldn't find that. Some of this became like needle in the haystack thing. I did do research, for example, in the State Archive in Belém do Pará, looking for stuff about Guaraná. It was very difficult because, it's all about the export of rubber, let's say, from the 19th century. And I talk about this as like an epistemological kind of challenge, and why I believe there had been no full-length book written about Guaraná till mine came along, because I benefited from the internet, which took me to those crazy discoveries that you mentioned about those soda companies or these weird medical journals. But that was in compensation for a lack of more traditional type of archival information that I was more familiar with from my book on rubber, which looked more at conditions of production. And even there, that was always, got short shrift, because the generation of knowledge about those conditions was limited by inaccessibility, by remoteness, et cetera. Narrative formations. So excellent observation. I initially wanted to have individuals like ground every single chapter. And this is an interesting question. It was because I was very much challenged by the fact that a good part of my documentation about Guaraná was written by scientists. So I'm not a natural scientist, and I have some difficulties with that material, and I didn't find it particularly interesting. And there's only so much you can talk about the chemical, context of Guaraná or its botanical ramifications and studies. So I looked for a way to bring human actors. I mean, clearly those articles by scientists, by botanists, by biologists, by chemists, they're written by people, and I did incorporate their voices and that segment of society in talking about the sources, but I felt limited in how much I could work with that. So initially, I tried to do that for every chapter. This cost me a lot of time on the manuscript because about halfway through, and I started with the Silva Coutinho story. It was the first full-length study that I found. I'd never seen a reference to it. It was really rich in historical resonance for the 19th century. And he's a very interesting character. And he had an archive in Belém, not too much about that particular, his study of Guaraná, but I knew there'd been stuff written about him and I wanted to build the chapter around that. And then I found something, similar for some of the other protagonists. But I realized that for the Embrapa chapter, for example, I started out trying to do that and I didn't have the information. I'm like, and furthermore, it was a big challenge to kind of, I think as Barbara was mentioning, to balance like the content with the context, because you're focusing on this one commodity and you wanted to do all these things. And one of the things you wanted to do is illustrate context or speak to broader context. Like the biographies of the people made it even more challenging, because then it was getting me further astray from the plant, which is the subject of this study. And so, yes, there is that switch. I lost a lot of time on that because I had to like rip apart chapters or reconfigure chapters, which weren't working for me. But that's what I ultimately settled on. And I guess it's not ideal, but I couldn't maintain it throughout the manuscript, or I couldn't maintain it without, I felt severely distorting what I thought was more of the more important aspect or takeaway from those chapters. Appropriate, circulate, and exchange. So I haven't well, I guess appropriate for me would suggest a more active signification. I think that's how I'm using it, of Guaraná by external actors, and that appropriation and redefinition of the plant or the use of the plant or the symbol of the plant, then in turn is intrinsic to the way the product is now exchanged and circulated, and how new meanings are ascribed or attributed to it, and how people come to understand it. What would I do differently? So I think I'm up of the bigger questions. So I often get asked about mate when I present on Guaraná. Sometimes acai, but actually more frequently mate. I do mention mate very briefly at the end in that chapter where I talk about the soft drugs, because I think the parallel there is mate was also known for many centuries. It was consumed much more regionally in South America, in the southern cone of South America, right, specifically, and in Brazil. And so I see some parallels there. And of course, it's another caffeinated beverage that's consumed in Brazil, and particularly in the south of Brazil. So if I would redo it differently, I think I would speak a little bit more extensively. I came to learn much more about mate after I concluded the book, because I read Christine Folch, who also has a new book about Guaraná, about mate, Julia Sareal's book, and Rebecca Pite's book. So, I definitely have more to say about distinctions and differences between the two caffeinated products. I mentioned I feel like a dearth of information on the small producer, which I did not really supply, which I guess if I could do it differently, I would have more information on that. You asked about disappointments. So my greatest disappointment, I would say, is incorporation of more of the indigenous voice in the narrative. I feel like I was able to get the indigenous voice through testimonies, through Satere Mawe have a website. I interviewed a Satere Mawe leader through WhatsApp, but I did make it to the town of Maués and to the regional, like Manaus and Belém, the regional the state capitals. But COVID kind of restricted my access to this region, and I kind of made the decision. This was at the height of like Bolsonaro's anti-indigenous, anti-environmental campaigns and their very deleterious effects in the Amazon. And I felt it was important to get the book out because of how it pushes back against some of those canards and some of those damaging stereotypes and stigmas and policies. So I would like to return to the region and to meet with the producers in that cooperative and learn more about their perspective. So there is a great deal of sensitivity. You talked about that, like the politics of taking on the indigenous voice. I wrestled with that too. And I don't think there's a perfect answer for that. I mean, first of all, I asserted and affirmed my own positionality. I think I tried to be very sensitive with what we know, what we don't know, like any historian should be, and what we can say or can't say. But there's also the politics if I eliminated the indigenous voice because my own voice is a type of appropriation, that's very problematic as well, because the whole history of, intrinsic to the histories of indigenous marginalization and exploitation in Brazil have been narratives of erasure. So, and this plant and this crop, is so much linked to indigenous forms of knowledge that I felt that I could rely on ethnographic studies and, early reports for the earlier part of the history, and then indigenous voices and testimonies that came through more contemporary websites or publications for more current history. Coca-Cola, you asked me about. Yeah, so Elmore's book, I did read that. For me, that's a much more traditional, it's an excellent book, environmental history, because if we're talking about the same book, it looks at specifically like the environmental impacts of Coca-Cola and the production of Coca-Cola on water and pollution, whatever the other issue. It's been a while. So yeah, it's a different take. I don't think I'm a traditional environmental historian in that sense, because I try to, as I said in my presentation, I try to blend or bring together different types of approaches and methodologies. And the other connection to Coca-Cola, and you could link it to something that I regret about the book, is that I refer to the creator of Coca-Cola in the book as James Pemberton, who was an Atlanta pharmacist that created the formula. And his name is John Pemberton. So it's very embarrassing to me that people who know about Coca-Cola will know that I got his first name wrong. And when you see an author makes a mistake with one thing, you wonder where else they went off. But what was interesting about that was, you talk about moments of great disappointment. That was a moment of great euphoria, because I did find online, by total serendipity, an article that he wrote that I mentioned in the book, where he specifically slams Guaraná and how it was very ineffective and untrustworthy form of caffeine. And of course, because he wasn't using it in his formula for his soda, he had ulterior motives for, trashing it. But there is that, not just comparative aspect of the history, but the connective aspect of the histories that I think is interesting too. And getting back now, I think that covered most of the questions. Barbara, your question about indigenous roots and about acai comparative. Right. So I think, first of all, that, I don't know, maybe the Brazilians in the audience could correct me. I think that most Brazilians know that that Guaraná comes from the Amazon. I don't think most Brazilians know the link to the Sateremaué people and the myths, as maybe I'm wrong. I mean, it's certainly well known because the soda itself advertises that it's from the Amazon, that it's authentically Brazilian, etc. So I guess there's an understanding that it has indigenous roots, but I think it's Amazonian, environmental, like, ecological roots that have more prominence in the way in which the product is marketed. Even the period that I'm looking at, and I did have that slide, that advertisement of the indigenous man, and in early soda labels, you had indigenous women that were used to market the soda. That was certainly part of the early marketing, but it was never the only iconography that was used. And I didn't get a chance to show those other slides, but even in the 1940s, you already have this sort of the leisured class that is athletic, but it's also relaxing and using the soda as part of their day-to-day activities. And that's white, basically, middle class, upper class. So, I don't think that indigenous peoples were or the sole ways in which or indigeneity is the sole way in which it was marketed moving to the second half of the 20th century. And even before that, you did have more prominence about its indigenous roots, perhaps, but there were other ways in which the message was being diluted. The acai connection, so speaking of indigenous sort of iconography, so as far as I know, the first company that promotes acai in the United States is Sambazan. Interestingly, like blending samba and the Amazon, but whatever. and that packaging shows an indigenous man with like a headdress, so it's playing on all those ideas of exotica that marketers of stimulants have used those tricks and those marketing techniques for centuries, basically. So you see that being promoted in the case of acai. I think there might be a difference here also in terms of, I think the question was about like why it's not as well known or widely consumed outside of I think there's a difference perhaps in the way in which the plant is, where it can be grown maybe, and certainly the processing, because I don't know enough about acai, but clearly they have to create that pulp, when it's shipped outside of the Amazon. Whereas in the case of Guaraná, the soda companies, they don't use that labor-intensive method of drying and smoking and the ways in which the traditional loaves are prepared. They just pulverize the seeds. So I'm not sure to what extent the environmental limitations and the marketing or distribution limitations on acai have contoured the way that Amazonian product has entered into different markets vis-a-vis Guaraná. It's something I should, I guess, look further into. So thank you for that suggestion.
Thank you so much, Seth. Thank you very much. So, got time for a couple of questions.
I have two questions about Guaraná the soda. The first is a small one. Do you have any insight into when the orange slice was added as part of the ritual of drinking Guaraná? Curious about that. Maybe there's nothing on that. The second thing is going back to the comparison to Coca-Cola and thinking again about Elmore's book. It's also kind of a business history too, and he says that Coca-Cola, kind of the genius behind it is they sell syrup and branding, if I recall correctly. They don't own any of the sugar plantations, the cola plantations, and the bottlers are the ones that do it, that receive that and then produce it basically. So I'm wondering if Antarctica, like if you learned anything about just anything that was unique about I guess Guaraná capitalism, for lack of a better term, something that it was maybe distinct or maybe confirm something about capitalist development in Brazil, just the model of how Guaraná soda is produced.
John, the 20th was the century of the caffeine, right? 20th century. And we used to drink coffee. One cup of coffee has about 100 to 200 milligrams of caffeine. The same amount of tea, 48 milligrams of caffeine. Acai, something 40 milligrams of acai, of caffeine. And Guaraná, between 3,000 and 4,000 of milligrams of caffeine. This is difference between them. And the question is why we cannot, we not explore more this caffeine of Guaraná and produce as a commodity. I think we need to publish this data, to publish this. I remember in my dissertation of of a doctoral program, I used a lot guarana in powder. Yes, yes, because I have to they stay days awake, and I guarantee it works very well.
Thanks. Yes, thank you for that comment about the business history. And that would be another dimension of the study that I regret not being able to develop. I never made it to, I confess I didn't even try to get access to the corporate archives of Compañía Paulista Antártica. I just, I thought I would be turned away, and I felt, there's other ways to tell the story, but because of that, I do not have as much about the business history. There were some testimonies by former executives from that company that talked about marketing strategies. So, and there's material by advertising executives that talked about working with that company. So that's why the focus in terms of the business history was more about the marketing and the advertising as opposed to these questions about production or distribution. I did find some stuff online about this, and business history is not my forte anyway, so that would be another problem. It's another dimension of the story that certainly could be told in exploring like the history of capitalism and industrial capital in Brazil and the expansion of these industries. At the end of the study, I talk about how that company is then acquired by Ambev and becomes Ambev. The two big soda companies and beer companies merge, and now it's part of a gigantic multinational conglomerate like InBev, which has holdings in beverages. I think Anheuser-Busch is one of the companies, and some of the other big beer companies in, I think Modelo, maybe in Mexico. And yeah, so there is certainly a bigger story to be told here. The question about the caffeine, yeah, I mean, I think that's, first of all, what you've expressed was the frustration of countless Brazilian planners and scientists that I encountered in the source material. Like, this is such a rich source of caffeine. They were constantly touting how it had more caffeine than those other products, even at these world fairs where they would display the guarana. So that's also a very old trope, right? And we only learned that in the 19th century when they start measuring this type of stuff, I guess. But I think the issue there is, like, the amount of capital invested in coffee plantations and the longer history, the role of enslaved labor in launching of those industries, in the widespread acceptance and routinization of the consumption of those beverages, the corporate and government interests behind the protection and promotion of those industries. And that would be Coca-Cola as well, by the way, if you want to talk about competition on the soda level. Because sometimes people also ask me, like, why isn't the soda as well known as, Coca-Cola globally, right? So similar there in terms of the power of the different economic actors relative to the Brazilian producers of Guaraná, the drug, or Guaraná, the soda, right? And so it's a small farmer's crop, basically, in a remote region where distribution is very expensive, where local consumption accounts for most of, Guaraná was expensive within the Amazon because it was traded mainly in Mato Grosso. So traders made a lot of money. They had their established circuits, even going into Bolivia, actually, in the 19th century. So they had their markets. And it was difficult to coax more production from the local growers. Now, with the rise of agribusiness and with the soda industries specifically requiring more guaraná because of that law that makes them have a certain minimum, they become invested in creating plantations. So Brahma had its own plantation in Bahia, and Antarctica had its own plantation near Maués. But still, they're relying on small producers for acquisition of the crop. And so it just doesn't achieve the scale, but then again, acai, as Barbara was saying, no one knew about it, even outside of the Amazon within Brazil. And now you can get it anywhere. So who knows? I at South by Southwest festival in Austin, Texas, Sao Paulo, the state of São Paulo had a pavilion, and it was sponsored by local corporations. And I come into the pavilion, and there's all this stuff about Guaraná, Antarctica. I'm like, what's going on here? They're clearly sponsors of one of the sponsors of this event. And so I was fortunate to meet like the man in charge of international sales. That's where I learned. I knew about the factories in Portugal and Japan, and I did not know they'd opened up something in the United States and that they're looking to expand the market here. So it's not that they're not trying, and who knows what the future holds. You know, I share Guaraná with my students, and I always ask them, you know, as Brazilians ask me, what do you like better, Coca-Cola or Guaraná? And most of them like Guaraná more than Coca-Cola. So, the powder, yeah, 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 yeah. But until recently, the majority of the Guaraná crop is goes to the soda industry. So it's a smaller percentage that goes to the, and it's much more expensive than coffee, let's say, the powdered form. So, you know, I know many Brazilians from a certain generation talk about how they relied on Guaraná when they were studying for their exams, and it was a big craze in the 70s and 80s, maybe. Actually, I have in the book when powdered Guaraná was invented, because that was also like an advance in terms of the processing. But yeah, but it's also not accessible to everyone, right? So that's why, you know, poorer Brazilians are going to be more familiar with the soda. Hmm. 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 Hmm.
Thanks so much to John Totino for organizing this. Thanks to our presenters, Matt Johnson, Seth Garfield, our commentators, Barbara Weinstein and John McNeil. And once again, thanks to all of you. And there's beer and wine and other delights awaiting you on the back table.